الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بعد. We will start by continuing the components and the properties of a salah. So we covered how to perform an entire salah, what needs to be done when you're praying in one unit, and in what order. Now we're going to look at some of the miscellaneous masail involved in this chapter, and we'll talk about recitation in the very beginning. So he mentions وَيَجْهَرُ بِالْقِرَاءَةِ فِي الْفَجْرِ وفي ركعتين الأوليين من المغرب والعشاء إن كان إماما ويخفي القراءة فيما بعد الأوليين. That if a person is the imam, then in both units of the Fajr prayer and in the first two units of the Maghrib prayer and the Isha prayer, a person is going to recite out loud. Means that their voice should be audible to him and those people that are behind him. And after the first two units, whatever follows, so if it's one unit in Maghrib or two units in Isha, he's going to recite inaudibly. Means the people behind him can't hear him. If he himself hears it, that's not a problem, but it shouldn't be so loud that people behind him would be able to hear. Now, obviously, when praying through a microphone, sometimes even if you are saying it, what you deem to be silently, it's possible that the mic is going to pick up the voice and then it's going to amplify the voice, right? So that much is forgiven. That's something out of your control. That is not in its natural state. So I'm talking about reciting inaudibly in its natural state without a microphone. So if your speech is so low that without it, if people couldn't hear you, then this will be considered as ikhfa'ul qira'ah, as hiding what you are reciting. So this is for the imam, like it's necessary for the imam. What about a munfarid, a person praying alone? What is he supposed to do? He mentions afterwards, وَإِنْ كَانَ مُنْفَرِدًا فَهُوَ مُخَيِّرٌ إِنْ شَاءَ جَهَرَ وَأَسْمَعَ نَفْسَهُ وَإِنْ شَاءَ خَافَتْ. That for the person who is alone, they have an option, whether they choose to raise their voice and hear themselves, that's also permissible, and whether they choose and make their voice inaudible, and that is also permissible. And obviously we're talking about Fajr, Maghrib and Isha, because as far as Zuhr and Asr are concerned, even the Munfarid does not have the option. He too must recite silently in those two prayers. ويخفي الإمام القراءة في الظهر والعصر, and for the Zuhr and Asr, the Imam, as well as the Munfarid, the one praying alone, must make the recitation inaudible. Right? Now there's this question, what is considered loud and what is considered as a low voice, or what we might call inaudible, right? So jahar, or being out loud, is basically, so the fuqaha within the ahnaf define it in different ways. So for example, Imam Qarqi says that jahar, the lowest form, is that a person recites in a voice that he himself is able to hear. That will be known as jahar. right? That would be jahar. While makhafat or being inaudible basically means to just move your lips in the order of the verse of the Quran you're reading. Like you yourself can't hear you. While Imam Hamdawani says that makhafat is basically being able to hear yourself, right? So that's reciting silently. Just moving your lips around won't satisfy the requirement of the qira'ah. While jahar is actually raising your voice enough so that people behind you, if you're the prayer leader, can also hear you, right? So it's best not to just suffice by moving your lips. You should raise your voice enough that it reaches your ears, like if you're the imam. If you're the munfarid, obviously you have both options. But again, if you are a woman, it is better to do the mahafa, to do the ikhfa of your voice in order to preserve the sanctity of your hijab, especially if you fear that people who are not of your maharim might enter or pass from the place you are praying. But if it's an all-female jama'ah, the prayer leader is leading, then she should, at least in Fajr, Maghrib, and Isha, raise her voice enough that people behind her, at least the first row behind her, can hear her. And this not only involves al-qira'ah fi salah, so whether you are making zabiha, your tasmiyah should not be just to the fact that you're moving your lips. You, the one actually performing the act of zabiha, should be able to hear what you're trying to say. Also, the same thing is for anything which includes speech. So the minimum of speech is that you yourself should be able to hear it. So just moving your lips is not sufficient because not everybody can read lips, right? And so this confusion might be created as in what you're actually trying to say. And so in order to avoid that, the minimum in these things is that you yourself should hear you. So this was about the qira'ah. Now we're going to talk about witr a little bit. والوتر ثلاث ركعات لا يفصل بينها بسلام. Witr is actually 3 rakats, 3 units. لا يفصل بينهما بسلام, and it's not going to separate between with a salutation. So if you've ever been to Haram, you might see, especially in Ramadan, and the way they perform witr is first they perform 2 units. They say the salam, stand up for the third unit, and that third unit is separate from the first 2 units, right? So they also pray and perform 3 units, but they separate the 3 units in a 2-1 ratio with a salam in between, right? If you're there, if you're in the Haram or if you're in any Arab country where they perform witr like this, and you've joined the congregation, then you will pray witr as they do, right? But if you're alone, if you're in some place where the witr is not performed like that, then the method of performing witr is that you perform 3 units, all joined together. You don't separate between them with a salam, right? So that's the first thing to remember. And what should a person recite in the witr? Well, you can recite any surah that you want. There is nothing stopping you. But has Aisha radiallahu anha wa Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, they mentioned that the Prophet Islam in the first unit of witr used to recite Surah Al-A'la, أي سبح اسم ربك الأعلى. And the second unit, he used to recite قل يا أيها الكافرون. And in the third unit, he would recite قل هو الله أحد. So if you want to acquire the ajr of the sunnah as well, then when praying with her, you can pray with these surah in this order. First, Surah Al-A'la, then Surah Al-Kafirun, and to end with Surah Al-Ikhlas. Right? So that's second part related to its qira'ah. And the qira'ah of witr is a bit different than that from the Maghrib. Because in the Maghrib, in the first two units, you're audible. In the third, you're inaudible. But in witr, like if you're the imam, then all three units will be audible. But if you're praying individually, then none of the units will be audible. I mean, you should be praying them silently, as you would do Zohr and Asr. So that's one distinction between Witr and Maghrib. And basically why I make distinction between them is because they're both 3-unit prayers. The second distinction is that there's no qunut in Maghrib, but there is a qunut in Witr. And what's the qunut is that when you stand up for the third unit, you're done with your qira'ah, Surah Al-Fatiha, another surah with it. Then before going to ruku, before bowing down, you actually say Allahu Akbar and raise your hands. Then place them back on your chest. And then you recite dua al-qunut. So this is basically a qunut, which he mentions وَيَقْنُطُ فِي الثَّالِثَةِ قَبْلَ الرُّكُوعِ, that you're going to recite the qunut in the third unit before the ruku. في جميع السنة, and this is going to happen throughout the year. The reason why he's mentioning that this happens throughout the year is because according to Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, you only do the qunut in the last 15 days of Ramadan. You don't do it all year round, you only do it in the last 15 days of Ramadan. But according to Imam Abu Hanifa, qunut is actually done throughout the year, of Ramadan or out of Ramadan. First 15 days or last 15 days, it doesn't matter. You can do qunut throughout the year. And you can do it before you go to the ruku. Imam Shafi'i says that you do it after you come up from the ruku of the third unit, right? So it's okay. ويقرأ في كل ركعة من الوتر فاتحة الكتاب وسورة معها. In every unit, you will recite Fatiha and another surah with it. And like I mentioned, that if you want this ajr of sunnah, in the first, Surah Al-A'la, in the second, Surah Al-Kafirun, and in the third, Surah Al-Ikhlas. And by the way, this is another distinction between Maghrib and Witr, that in Maghrib, in the third unit, you only recite Surah Al-Fatiha. You don't add another surah with it. But in Witr, you actually do. With Surah Al-Fatiha, you will be adding another surah. فإذا أراد أن يقنط, and if a person, they want to perform the qunut, كبر ورفع يديه, they're going to say Allahu Akbar, raise their hands, ثم قنط, and then they're going to do the qunut. And now what is the qunut? Qunut, well, literally it means to stand. And so obviously if a person just stands, that could also do. There are some dua that the Prophet Islam has instructed us in the qunut, but they're not wajib. To perform any dua, to make any dua within the qunut should suffice. So if you don't know the long dua, right, if you're still learning that, if you know someone who's still learning that, you can tell them to make any dua. So just saying رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ, right? That could suffice for their qunut. They could say Allahumma ighfirli 3 times. So that's also qunut. Until you can learn the dua that the Prophet Islam has taught us. And so there are 2 du'as within the qunut, which have been transmitted by the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. The first, the more famous one, especially in a Hanafi fiqh context. اللهم إنا نستعينك ونستغفرك ونؤمن بك ونتوكل عليك ونثني عليك الخير. So let's go with the translation as well. Allahumma inna nasta'inuka. Ya Allah, I ask for your help, for your assistance. Wa nastaghfiruk. I ask for your forgiveness. Wa nu'minu bik. And we believe in you. Wa natawakkalu alayk. And we place our trust in you. Right? So that's the first part of the Dua al-Qunut, which is the famous one according to the Hanaf. Allahumma inna nasta'inuka wa nastaghfiruka wa nu'minu bik. I'm forgetting the second part. Interesting. Right, I remember now. ونتوكل عليك ونثني عليك and نثني عليك الخير and we praise you ونشكرك we thank you ولا نكفرك and we're not ungrateful ونخلع ونترك من يفجرك and we will leave for you those who disobey you. Allahumma iyyaka na'bud. Allah, oh Allah, you are the one we worship. Walaka nusalli, and for you we pray, wa nasjud, and for you we prostrate. Wa ilayka nas'a, and all our efforts are towards you. Wa nahfidu wa narju rahmatak, and we are hopeful for your rahmah, wa nakhsha adhabak, and fearful of your adhab, your punishment. Inna adhabaka bil kuffari mulhiq. Indeed, your punishment with the non-believers will stick. It will encompass them. So this is the one of the dua that is transmitted by the Sahaba in the Qunut. The other one uh, is the one that's mentioned in Sunan Abi Dawud and Tirmidhi as well. Allahumma hadina fi man hadayt. Ya Allah, guide me amongst those people you have guided. And make me amongst those people you have guided. Wa'afini fi man afayt. And give me and bless me afiyah. I make me among those people who you have given the afiyah. The afiyah is basically every good thing that can happen in this world and in the next, from ranging from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahmah, His maghfirah, His protection, barakah in your life, in your health, in your wealth, everything. So afiyah includes basically everything. So I don't know of an English word that can fully translate the word afiyah. So anyhow, wa'afini fi man afayt, and bless me with afiyah and give me afiyah amongst those you've given afiyah. وَتَوَلَّنِي فِي مَنْ تَوَلَّيْتَ, and become my guardian and make me amongst those people whose guardian you have become, whose umur and matters you take into your own hands. وَبَارِكْ لِي فِي مَا أَعْطَيْتَ, and give barakah to me in whatever you have already blessed me with. وَقِنِي شَرَّ مَا قَضَيْتَ, and protect me from whatever shar, from whatever bad decisions that are meant to be in this world. Any fitna, any adab, right? Protect me from all that. فَإِنَّكَ تَقْضِي وَلَا يُقْضَى عَلَيْكَ, for you're the one who makes decisions and no one can make any decision against you. إِنَّهُ لَا يَذِلُّ مَنْ وَالَيْتَ, those you have befriended cannot taste the dhul, cannot be disgraced. وَلَا يَعِزُّ مَنْ عَادَيْتَ, and those who you have become enemies with can never get any izzah, can never get any strength or quwwah, and cannot get any respect. تباركت ربنا وتعالى, great are you, my Lord, and most high. And so this was the second dua. Allahumma hdina fiman hadayt, wa afini fiman afayt, wa tawallayni fiman tawallayt, wa barik li fima a'tayt, wa qini sharra ma qazayt, fa innaka taqzi wa la yuqza alayk, innahu la yadhillu man walayt, wa la ya'izzu man a'adayt, tabarakta rabbana wa ta'alayt. And so you can choose to recite any of the two dua, combine both of these dua. If you want to add some other ad'iyah to it as well, as long as they're from the Quran and Sunnah, that's also pretty acceptable. You can suffice with any one of them. So you have all these options, and there's nothing to say that only one is the correct way, right? Just remember that making any dua is wajib. So you need to do the qunut. That's something that you need to do. But what you do in it, that is pretty much up to you. Lastly, he mentions وَلَا يَقْنُتُ فِي صَلَاةٍ غَيْرِهَا, i.e. that there is no qunut uh, other than the witr prayer. Again, here he's mentioning towards uh, a disagreement between us and Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, in which Imam Shafi'i says that there's also qunut in the Fajr prayer. If you've ever been to the Haramain, you might have observed this, that uh, they do qunut in the Fajr. But you're going to only observe this if you went um, in Ramadan, in the last 15 days, as they only do qunut in Ramadan. Now, there's also another type of qunut, ay qunut al-nazila. So whenever there is a situation in the ummah, right, a really difficult times, an enemy attacking, right, or something, other calamity, especially in a state of war. But for other things, like in our times today, for example, for the Muslim brethren in Turkey and Syria, of the earthquake that had happened there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect them, ease their pains, and get them out of this calamity. So in case of any calamity, there's also Qunut Nazla that for 30 days or a month or so, no longer than that, uh, in the Fajr prayer, after the Imam stands up from the ruku of the second unit, he makes the Qunut, and in which he prays for the well-being of the Muslimin, for protection, right, for cohesion between them, and whatever dua the Imam wishes to make, he's allowed to do so. Usually they start off with the second qunut, Allahumma hdina fi man hadayt, the dua that I just mentioned, and then add to it depending on whatever the situation the Muslim ummah is facing at the moment, right? So that can be amended according to whatever the nazila is. Nazila is known as the situation, the calamity of the moment. So the Imam can adjust the dua in regards to whatever the nazila is. And so that is also accepted, but it's not the norm. The norm is only performing the qunut in the witr prayer throughout the year. If there's a calamity for 1 month or less, the Imam is allowed to make the qunut in the Fajr prayer, but this happens after he stands up from the ruku of the second prayer. And the difference between this qunut and the qunut of witr is that you don't raise your hands in this qunut. Coming back to qira'ah, he mentions وَلَيْسَ فِي شَيْءٍ مِنَ الصَّلَاةِ قِرَاءَةٌ سُورَةٍ بِعَيْنِهَا لَا يَجُوزُ غَيْرُهَا. Right? So nowhere in any salah, whether it's faras, witr, sunnah, wajib, Eid, Jum'ah, tahajjud, tarawih, anything, there is no salah in which قِرَاءَةُ سُورَةٍ بِعَيْنِهَا, that a specific chapter of the Quran is fixed. in such a manner that if you don't recite it, your salah will be invalid. There's no such surah and there's no such salah. So maybe someone has the habit, they're making the sunnah of the Fajr prayers. In the first unit, they're reciting Suratul Kafirun. The second unit, they're reciting Suratul Ikhlas. Just because it was the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So that's not a problem. But if you fix a surah in such a manner that you start believing the fact that no other surah is permissible other than this, or not you, but someone else is getting the impression that these surah are like farz in this specific prayer. لا يجوز غيرها. So this is nothing. This has nothing to do with Islam, deen, or fiqh. It's actually makruh to do so. So he mentions in the next part, ويكره أن يتخذ قراءة سورة بعينها للصلاة لا يقرأ فيها غيرها. It is disapproved, disliked to adopt the recitation of a specific chapter for a specific prayer in a manner that you don't recite anything but that, right? So anything which can eventually lead to bid'ah or potentially lead to bid'ah, that is makruh. And specifying it with such vigor can actually open the pathways to a bid'ah, maybe not for you, but for the future generations. And so even though, like, that there are some prayers in which the Prophet Islam usually used to recite some specific surah, and we want to make a habit of that. Do make a habit of that. But once every few days, once maybe every fortnight, change the surah within those prayers, just so you don't go into the borders of makruh, right? Because what this is going to do is it's going to give you the impression that these surah are important, more important than the other surah of the Quran, which is not the case because all of uh, the chapters of the Quran, all of the verses of the Quran, for the fact that they are part of the Quran, are all equal. No one has any fazila over the other, right? Again, this only happens if a person starts believing or giving the impression to others that this is wajib or farz. If they're only doing for the sake of following the Prophet Islam and his Sunnah, then that's good. Now we're talking about qira'ah. What exactly is qira'ah? Like what constitutes as qira'ah? What is the minimum that a person needs to do in order for their prayers to be valid? وأدنى ما يجزئ من القراءة في الصلاة ما يتناوله اسم القرآن عند أبي حنيفة رحمه الله تعالى. وقال أبو يوسف ومحمد رحمهم الله تعالى لا يجوز أقل من 3 آيات قصار أو آية طويلة. The least amount of recitation in the prayer that suffices is whatever is comprised under the name of the Quran. Whatever amount you can say it's the Quran, then that constitutes as a recitation. According to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, right? And so what are the things that can be and cannot be? For example, anything less than ayah, for example, or anything which is basically an ayah, but maybe doesn't make complete sense without the context. For example, someone recites faqat lam yalid, right? That's an entire ayah in itself. Or walam yulad, that's also an entire ayah, right? Uh, According to Abu Hanifa, this is also recitation. And so if you recite this amount, we will consider that your farz recitation has been completed, right? Now, when talking about al-qira'ah fi salah, recitation in salah, know that there are five types of qira'ah. There's farz qira'ah, wajib, sunnah, mustahab, and makruh. So the farz is the basically one with which the jawaz of the salah or the validity of the salah is concerned, which according to Imam Abu Hanifa is at least two words of the Quran, like thumma nadar. So thumma and nadara, they're two words. This is a verse in Surah Al-Muddathir. This counts as a recitation, the first recitation. But there are some verses in which there's only one word. So, for example, the beginning of some of the chapters, for example, Noon. So the word Noon is one word, but it's a complete ayah in the Quran, right? Or Sod, that's also just one letter, not even a word, it's just one letter that is a complete ayah in the Quran. Or like Mudhammatan in Surah Al-Rahman. So it's one word, right? So the question is, can one word, one harf, one letter, or one word, can that suffice for the qira'ah? The answer to that is no. It should be at least two words for it to constitute as a qira'ah or anything on which you can say that this is part of the Quran, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullahu ta'ala. And according to the Sahibain, they say that less than three small verses or one long verse, that's not sufficient. And this is what you usually hear when you first study the farais of Salah, that you recite either three small verses, one long verse, or one small surah of the Quran. So that is the first qira'ah that needs to be done. The wajib qira'ah is the qira'ah of Fatiha and another surah with it, right? Then there's this masnoon qira'ah, the sunnah. And what is that? Is for a person to actually recite a surah from the Tiwal al-Mufassal in the Fajr and Zuhr prayers. So in the Fajr and Zuhr prayers, in the first two units, it is the sunnah to perform a chapter from the Tiwal al-Mufassal. And what is the Tiwal al-Mufassal? It is a collection of surah which starts from Surah Al-Hujurat in the 26th juz of the Quran till Surah Al-Buruj in the 30th juz of the Quran. So that's Tiwal al-Mufassal. So in Fajr and Zohar, a person, if they recite from Tiwal al-Mufassal, they get the ajr of Sunnah as well. And in Asr and Isha, to recite from the Awsat al-Mufassal is Sunnah. And what is the Awsat al-Mufassal? It's the collection of chapters ranging from Surah al-Buruj uh, to Surah Lam Yakun, which comes at near the end of the 30th Juzul Am. And in Maghrib, it is Sunnah to recite from the Qisar al-Mufassal, which starts from إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ, Surah Al-Zilzal, to the end of the Quran, to قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. So again, to summarize, in Fajr and Zuhr, one should, not must, one should perform from the Tiwal al-Mufassal, Surah Al-Hujurat to Surah Al-Buruj, Surah Al-Buruj not included. In Asr and Isha, they should recite from the Awsat al-Mufassal, which starts from Surah Al-Buruj ila Lam Yakun, and Lam Yakun is included. And in Maghrib, they should recite from the Qisar al-Mufassal, which starts from Surah Al-Zilzal ila Zulzilat till Surah Al-Nas, Qul A'udhu bin Nas. That is the masnoon qira'ah. Then there's the mustahab qira'ah, and it is in Fajr, if a person is not traveling, then their first unit, they should recite somewhere between 30 to 40 verses other than Fatihatul Kitab. And in the second unit, they should pray between 20 to 30 verses other than Fatihatul Kitab. So the first unit should be longer than the second unit in the Fajr prayer. And that's mustahab. As for all other prayers are concerned, there should be equality in them. I mean, the first unit should be as long as the second unit. But in Fajr, to allow more people to be able to join the congregation, the Imam should lengthen the first unit uh, more than the other units, or the second unit. Not just Fajr, and for Tarawih as well. So the first unit should be longer than the second unit. If he doesn't, it's okay. It's not that as if it's going to affect the Salah in any way. But just to help people out, a person should do that, or the Imam should do that. So this was about the recitation and how much you should recite. Now to answer a question which we've actually answered the previous week. وَلَا يَقْرَأُ الْمُؤْتَمُ خَلْفَ الْإِمَامِ. That whoever, the follower should not recite behind the Imam, right? In fact, we mentioned an ayah from Surah Al-A'raf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَإِذَا قُرِئَ الْقُرْآنُ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَأَنصِتُوا. When the Quran is being recited, listen to it carefully and keep quiet. And almost all of the Mufassirin say that this verse was revealed about prayer, right? You also have the hadith that uh, Imam Tahawi has mentioned, Man kana lahu imam fa qira'atul imam lahu qira'at. Whoever has an imam, then the imam's recitation is the recitation for the muqtadi, for the follower, right? And so Ubaidullah ibn Maqsim, he says that I asked Abdullah ibn Umar, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhum, and all of them told me that لا تقرأ خلف الإمام في شيء من الصلاة, that do not recite behind the Imam in any of the Salah. So you can see it's absolute whether you can hear the Imam or you cannot hear the Imam. So you have the Prophet Islam instructing you the same thing, the Quran telling us to listen carefully and be quiet, and the Sahaba understanding the exact same thing and telling Ubaydullah ibn Maqsam that in any of the Salah, you're not supposed to recite behind the Imam. And so these are just a few of the many ahadith and many athar al-Sahaba in regards to with this particular issue. So anyhow, if you are behind the Imam, you should not be reciting, at least not moving your lips. If you want to, for the sake of attention and mindfulness, go over the verses in your head. You can do that, right? It's far better than actually going here and there, thinking about worldly matters, that you concentrate on the words of the surah. So you can go over them in your head if you want, but just don't move your lips with it. ومن أراد الدخول في صلاة غيره يحتاج إلى نيتين نية الصلاة ونية المتابعة. Whoever wants to enter into the prayer led by another person requires two intentions. Number one, the intention of praying, And number two, the intention of following the Imam, right? Because once you make the niyyah, once you make the niyyah, you actually hand over your salah to the Imam, which means your salah is now binded to that of the salah of the Imam. If for some reason his salah gets invalidated, your salah as the muqtadi will also become invalid. And if you make a mistake within your salah, right, uh, your salah is again bound to that of the Imam, and the Imam prays the salah perfectly, your salah will remain unaffected. It'll be still complete and valid. So whenever you're praying behind an Imam, you should be more worried of the Imam making a mistake than you yourself. Because again, you're completely bound to the Imam. So you have so in order for you to give up your salah to someone else, you have to make that niyyah, the intention of the mutaba. And when should you make this intention? Well, you can make this intention at the time when you're making the niyyah of the salah, when you're standing in the saf. You can also make the intention after the Imam says Allahu Akbar, because obviously this is an intention of following the Imam. And before the Imam actually starts the prayer, you're not following him. So the niyyah should be made after the Imam has actually commenced something.